Hi, so we're fortunate enough to have our keynote for today to be Jon Robinson. He's a multidisciplinary user experience consultant, creative director, and design educator. He's based in St. Louis currently as an experience strategy and design consultant at Slalom. Jon has more than 14 years experience creating and managing brands, developing strategic packaging, and designing and building human-centered user interfaces for both business-to-business and consumer-facing companies. And today, he's here to talk on the UX mindset and that weaves into the World Usability Day theme this year of designing for the future we want. So if you can give a round of applause for Jon, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Good? Awesome. Thanks for having me. So I work for Slalom in St. Louis, and we're a little newer. We've been around for about 3 years. We're a global consulting firm with about 35 locations or so, primarily located in North America with a few locations in the UK. And our St. Louis practice has actually grown to have one of the largest experience strategy and design practices out of all of our Slalom offices. We also have a large healthcare team, for example, I was able to spend some time with before I came here today, but I'm not really here to talk about healthcare. Actually, when you all reached out to me and asked me to come, I thought, I know exactly what I'm going to talk about. I was really excited. I finally was going to be able to put this talk together. And I started to do my research around it. And you know that feeling that you have when you feel like you've devoted your whole life to a topic, researching something, just to find that someone else has beat you to publication? It's totally soul-crushing. So I was so bummed. I mean, she covers all the good stuff like Sour Bright crawlers and Reese's Pieces, all my true passions. So instead, I'm going to talk about user experience today. There's this really great quote that I read in Neil deGrasse Tyson's Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. Actually, I was listening to the ebook, or I'm sorry, the audiobook, which I still call book on tape most of the time. But essentially, it went something like, the foundation of a research-based mind is ignorance. And so I want to start with this quote to kind of help set the stage for an open-minded, curious approach to understanding the basic principles of a typical user experience mindset. But honestly, that quote aside, I've found that the best way to really start this conversation is with a fable. All right? It's a very dynamic way to kind of illustrate the differences between our typical users and UX-minded people and the roles that we play with a good old-fashioned fable. The Frog and the Centipede, some of you may be familiar with this. So essentially, one day a frog was leaping through the forest and encountered a centipede. He was immediately entranced by the harmony and organization behind that centipede's movements. Certainly it wasn't like how pretty that centipede was. And he stopped to take it all in, marveling at the amazing ability that this 100-footed insect had to coordinate and time all of those legs into these precise, graceful, fluid movements. And so the frog felt like really ordinary for having to move only 2 arms, 2 legs to move around. It's not really that impressive. So hoping to be enlightened, he said to the centipede, "I'm very impressed. I could never do that the way that you do it. Would you mind if I asked you, how do you do that?" And the centipede said, "I've never really bothered to think about it." So determined to come up with a better answer, she started to think through all those motions, right? And the more she thought about it, the more complicated that whole process became. She wasn't really sure how she did it. Now confused, when trying to move, she just tripped over herself, attempting to walk. And it kind of led to frustration, and eventually she was like this uncoordinated mess, totally unable to move. And during that time, the frog just kind of looked on in curious amusement, not knowing what the hell was going on, right? More like, ah. And so eventually, the centipede was so embarrassed that she got up without thinking, quickly and smoothly ran away. The lesson that we learned from this is that analysis is paralysis. When we think too much about the actions that we need to perform, ones that come naturally to us, our mind can trip us up. The centipede, who's our user in this fable, thought too much about what came naturally to her. And she was correct in her final assessment of, I don't know how I do it, and I really don't care. I don't want to know how. I just want to be able to do it. The frog, on the other hand, is more kind of inquisitive and curious, more UX-minded. He sees something he finds fascinating, and he wants to know more about it. Not so that he can do that thing himself, but so that he understands the mechanics behind it and how it works and what makes it enjoyable. Who here drinks non-dairy milk? Okay, a lot of people, right? I do. My whole family does. But back in 1978, Silk got its big break when it finally was entered into a national supermarket chain for the first time. Now, non-dairy milks like almond and soy milks, they're shelf-stable, so they don't have to be refrigerated until after they're opened. But back in 1978, no one really knew that well, except for the makers of the product. So initially, Silk and all of its products were parked right in the produce section, next to other shelf-stable things, like the ingredients that the milk was made out of. Sales were consistently low, and the company didn't really know why, right, until they talked to people and realized that no one is going to buy warm milk. No one trusts that product. It wasn't until they took it and they moved it to the refrigerated section of the grocery store next to the dairy milk that people started to say, hey, I'll give this a try, right? Silk knew their product. They knew their market, their business really well, but they didn't understand their consumer or what they wanted or what motivated them. I think what this tells us as researchers is sometimes we need to experience the pain first to be able to understand it. And I love living in this like analytical problem-solving culture that embraces question asking, right? Not just the obvious ones, but the dumb questions as well. Because we value things that work smoothly and logically. Anytime we analyze details, question the way things work, or just observe people, or insects for that matter, we're collecting data on everyday interactions and strengthening our level of understanding around those things. Approaching problems with embraced ignorance, right, by first assuming that we know nothing, and an inquisitive mind allows us to dig deep beneath the surface of those problems. That's how we learn to empathize. So these ideas have always been kind of a natural inclination for me, obsessing over the way things work and analyzing interactions and the steps that it takes to perform them. Now, this obviously isn't me, but you get the idea. And questioning things that like I find illogical or inefficient. UX-minded people, we're the kind of people that want to take the computer apart because we want to know what's inside of it. Or we're curious about the mechanics that exist like behind or within machines, and how the hell do they keep my orange soda from tasting like root beer and vice versa, right? And we shoot from that general, how do I make this process more efficient standpoint. This is a photo of a California State DMV, not like standing room only at a conference. All right, even though that's what it probably looks like. This is not a process that was designed for people. This is not a process that was designed with people in mind or people's needs in mind, right? And this is where our processes often fail. So we live in an age of self-service, and it becomes very apparent today that we are all users, right? It doesn't mean that we all perform that action, but we all have that potential. We all have that capability to be, whether we know it or not. And whether it's from the traditional to the convenience economy, we see self-service, user-focused experiences moving into new spaces all the time. This is not an endorsement for Redbox, by the way. And self-service experiences play a really valuable role in scaling companies and helping them reach new customers. We also demand immediacy from everything, not just the tools, but simplifications of those processes and those experiences. I no longer have to stand outside and hail a taxi cab. I no longer have to go to the grocery store. I can order all of my groceries and have someone deliver it to my door. I no longer have to talk to people in a bar to meet them, right? So even things like going down to these like primal needs, human needs like companionship, are all things that I can fulfill digitally with electronic tools. I am a member of my local library foundation board, and about a year ago, when I was going through the process of interviewing to join, in fact, I think it was like October, November of last year, I was having a conversation and some data was shared with me that I found really fascinating. And it's that in the era of the smartphone, so essentially the last 12 years, the number of reference questions asked to library staff has decreased by 42%. And that probably doesn't sound really as low as it should be, but we're not talking about in the age of widespread internet connectivity. We're talking about the era of information at your fingertips anytime, anywhere, right? It used to be that if you wanted to know George Washington's birthday and you didn't have access to an encyclopedia, you went and called your local library, or you went down there. And this is the service or the role that librarians served, was the finder and keeper of information. So, don't tell your local librarian, but we're kind of all librarians now, right? Because we all have that access. We are all the keepers and finders of that info, whatever info we need. But the cool thing about this is, in that same time period, where they saw that 42% decrease in reference questions asked to library staff, they saw a nearly 200% increase in program attendance. And this tells us that even in a self-service economy, people still crave more than just digital experiences. Going back to the slide from earlier, we can put self-service kiosks in McDonald's. But that doesn't mean that we are always going to use them, right? It doesn't mean that we are always going to avoid every person-to-person, human-to-human experience that we could have out in public. And we see that libraries, for example, are starting to introduce self-service kiosks, right? That doesn't mean that everyone's going to just immediately move toward those. Obviously, there are some times when you go to the library and you want to check out a book on a topic that may be embarrassing to you, and other times you're just grabbing a movie, and it's not that big of a deal. We still crave some of that human touch, right? We're not moving toward like a completely soulless, humanless world. So because of that everyone is a user marketplace, I go ahead and define user experience as both singular and accumulated experiences that result from users interacting with any object in any given context. It's very broad. But these are not all like completely infallible ideas, because we're still somewhat in an era of adoption. My grandmother, for example, who reached the age of 89 years old, never once pumped her own gas in her entire life. It was a service that she just relied on other people to do for her. Or if we looked at something like as iconic as a play button, right? An incredibly high percent of everyone would immediately understand its use, its function, what it means, what it represents, and what it does. It's got a high level of what we refer to as affordance, right? Which is an existing relationship between an object and a person that implies a specific or intended outcome. And I bet that probably a lot of people are assuming that I'm going to click to advance and there's a video that's going to play. It's not, right? But that's the anticipation that exists within this symbol. No matter the interface, right? Whether it's a browser, a smart TV, or a VCR, we know how to initiate a video just by seeing this. But is that always true in every scenario? About a year ago, my mom was staying with us, and my wife and I were going to go out for the night. And she was going to watch the kids, and the kids really wanted to watch a movie. So I grabbed the disc, and I threw it in the Blu-ray player. I switched the input over on the TV, and I handed her the remote. And I said, it's all ready to go. When they're ready to watch the movie, just go ahead and hit the play button. And she goes, which one is that? And I didn't really know how to react. So I said, the play button. And she says, sure, I don't know what that is. And maybe out of confusion, or a mix of the fact that I am the type of person who will pick a hill and die on it, I stared at her for a second. See, look, technology, right? It's wonderful. I stared at her for a second, and I could have explained. I could have assumed she doesn't know what I'm talking about. Maybe I should fill her in. But instead, I pounded my fists and emphatically said, the play button. This is a symbol that has like more than 30 years of understanding around it. And I gave in, and I took the remote, and I showed it to her. And she said, you should have just said the arrow. Well, that got us into a conversation about what arrow buttons do on remotes, right? What I found was that my mom, who was 65 years old at the time, had never used a remote control in her entire life. At home, to change the channel or to turn the volume up or down or the TV off, she gets up from the couch or from bed or wherever else and walks to the TV and uses the controls on it. She had no idea what I was talking about when I told her the play button. We're always going to have wild cards, right? And we have to keep those people in mind too. We have to make things easily understandable, but we can never really assume that we're 100% correct or that we know exactly where we're going. Now, that experience that she had with her old tube TV was still a user experience. It might not be an ideal one. It might not be a great one, but it still fits the category, right? And because I spent, I got my start as a print designer, I will fight you to the death if you tell me that a book cannot be a user experience. When was the last time you walked into Barnes & Noble and something caught your eye, right? And you walked over and you picked it up, and encouraged you to turn it over and look at the back and open it up and look at the flaps on the inside. See, user experience is so many things. And there's often, we often talk about it with there being this common misunderstanding that when we do talk about it, we're particularly talking about actions that revolve around digital interfaces, right? And that's not the case. So the originator of all this, Don Norman, in this 1988 book, which most of us are probably familiar with, The Design of Everyday Things, he defined a user interface, user experience relationship as related to anything designed by humans for humans, whether it's a building or a service or a mobile application. It doesn't matter what it is. And essentially, anything that we can have a real-world tactile experience with is a UI. And UX exists basically in everything that we interact with in our daily lives. And in that book, he uses this famous example of the intended simplicity of doors. And I would assume that probably a lot of this audience has heard this before, but doors are simple. Whenever I interact with one in the real world, I should understand how to use it. I turn knobs, I push plates, I pull or slide handles, depending on the design of that, right? You see, bad interactions in both physical and virtual worlds create obstacles between a user and a product, like a push door that you keep mistakenly pulling by accident. Doors should never have to come with instructions, right? Nor should most things. So for those members of like the BuzzFeed generation in the attendance, I put together a list of 3 things, 3 common traits that I feel exist within UX-minded people. And the first is we're curious, but not that kind of curious. This kind, observant. When we use something, when we purchase plane tickets from an app, when we read a book, when we visit a museum, we keep our minds present. When we scan the actions we perform, we consider those behind-the-scenes tools and reflect on like the successes and the failures that we have with interacting with that thing. We ask questions of other people, and we analyze like those shared experiences and opinions, and we're open to alternative viewpoints. At the same time, we observe like the way that other people interact. And all of this feeds into a database of experiences that we pull from, right? Number two, we are really difficult to please. Culturally, we're surrounded by bad design everywhere we go, all the time, to the point where we become like accepting of bad design. When people are faced with a problem or, say, a product that they can't understand, they usually just assume that like it's their fault. I must not be smart enough to figure out how to use this thing. And that's that point that Norman calls the gulf of evaluation. Did my actions lead me to a goal? Well, UX-minded people, we don't really give those things a pass. We kind of like notice it, we're annoyed by it, and we want to fix it, right? Which really leads into number three. We're problem solvers. We're more inclined to help connect people to people or people to products and solution around the things that bother us because we understand that idea that we are all users. We value things that work smoothly and work logically. All of this is human-centered thinking. Now, I kicked this off with the joke about my love of candy, which is true. But I also am a huge fan of golden age science fiction and like the age of exploration that it both fostered and reacted to. And one of my favorite quotes comes from a book, a short sci-fi novel from the 1940s by Theodore Sturgeon titled The Microcosmic God. And that quote about the protagonist of this story is he was always asking questions, and he didn't mind very much when they were embarrassing. If he was talking to someone whose knowledge was already in his possession, he repeatedly asked, "How do you know?" Raise your hand if you love hearing, "We don't need to test this or research it. We know," right? We know we're on the right track. That's not an acceptable answer. And so we often talk about audience, especially in the marketing world where I spent a lot of time before coming to UX world. There's a big difference between knowing your audience and understanding your audience. Knowing is associated with all that like top-level data, such as unique monthly site visitors, conversion rates, etc., like all of our general analytics stuff. That's measurable data. It doesn't really give us the metrics we need to understand what people think, how people act. Understanding, which I put way more value on, is about getting into the brains and hearts of those people behind those numbers so we can anticipate and make more informed decisions. With analytics, we can target a specific type of person, but to build lovable products and experiences, we need to empathize with everyone. On your left, that's my daughter at your local Legoland last February. I do a lot of work with student groups, and roughly a year ago, I was kind of in the Midwest talking to some students, and I was talking about this specific thing, lovable products, and understanding like motivations behind why I would choose one product over another. And there was a student at the table that had been pretty quiet the whole time. And I noticed that she had one of those HP 360 laptops in front of her that can flip all the way around like a notebook, right? And so she was a design student, and I said, "Why do you use that? Why do you not have a MacBook? What is it about that HP 360 that you enjoy?" And now she had pretty much not shown any emotion the entire time, but as soon as I asked her that question around her product, she picked it up and she goes, "Because I can do this." She got a big smile on her face, right? And she showed me how it flipped all the way around, and I can take a stylus and I can write on it, and I can take handmade notes, and her face just lit up, right? We understand people's motivations by talking to them, by asking them, "Tell me about this thing that you're using, and why do you use that over another one?" You see, knowing is like just the tip of the iceberg, and understanding requires us to get really, really dig beneath the surface. So today we embrace things that simplify our lives, right? But in the 1950s, General Mills launched a line of cake mixes in a box under the Betty Crocker name, right? We all know these. We use them still today. But in the 1950s, they didn't go over very well. Essentially, the idea was you take all the ingredients of a cake and you turn it into dry goods and put it in a box, and all that you have to do at home is add water and throw it in the oven. You got yourself a cake. but they didn't sell well, and they couldn't really figure out why. So they started talking to the housewives, who were their target audience for this, and they said, what's the problem here? We've made this product that should make it easier for you to make a great cake at home and give you more time to do other things. And they found out that they felt guilty using the product. They felt that, now again, remember, this is the 1950s. They felt that they were somehow deceiving their friends and their family because they weren't really doing much with this product. It was their job to stay at home and take care of the house and cook for the family and put a lot of effort into this. And so to them, using this product was almost like they were lying to those people that relied on them. So General Mills was faced with kind of like two options. They could run a series of ads that said, hey, it's okay to do this, to use our product, because now you have more time in your day to clean the house, do the laundry. But instead, they changed it. They said, you know what? Crack an egg in there. And for some reason, that little extra step made people feel more comfortable with using the product. It wasn't until they actually spoke to people to understand what the problem was to be able to fix that, right? You see, we have to be intentional with all the decisions that we make because we're solving real-world problems for real people. We tend to post-rationalize a lot. And when I worked in the creative agency world, we did this a lot, right? We'd come up with a solution for like a product name or a company logo, and as long as we could craft a really good story around that after the fact and feel like we could tell that story really well, then we knew we were on the right track. It might not mean this now, but we can make it mean this thing later. And so we definitely never talked to any of our users or our audience. We knew who they were, but we didn't really understand them or their motivations. So to illustrate like this, there are several reasons that I kind of left that creative agency world and came to user experience design. Now, outside of the main one being the focus on people. But the work that I was doing, I felt like there was no real value in it. I didn't design my first website until 2014. And I loved it. I thought it was great. And then that's all I did for several years. But it was 4 years later that we revisited that same site, that first one that I had ever designed, and we were going to do some like maintenance upkeep work on it, and I saw that nothing had changed. In 4 years, it existed out in this nebulous world by itself and had not been touched. The same 3 blog posts that we launched that site with in 2014 were still the same 3 blog posts on that website in 2018. Basically, the product was stagnant right out of the gate, right? Because most of our clients, they just needed that thing, and when that thing was done, they were like, cool. It went live, we're finished, let's move on to that next thing. There's no value there. Waterfall failed me, right? And you could say that like, we got input from users sometimes, but at one point I was working on this really large product database that a company was going to use to manage all of their brands. And true to waterfall method, we designed it, and when it was completed and approved, we handed it off to our development partners and said, here you go make this thing for us. This is what it's going to be. And after like 4 to 6 months of this thing being behind, they finally got back to us and said, you know what? We've actually kind of been lying to you guys. Like, we don't have the capability or the capacity to make this thing, so I don't know when it's going to be finished. I don't want to say any more about that. That's good enough. So lastly, I was more and more often being discouraged from asking questions. And the traditional agency model became so focused on just pleasing the customer that we were taking their assurances at face value all the time. Asking questions and validating assumptions became devalued, leaving me feeling like this pretty much all the time, right? And so slapping meaning on to something at the end of a product at the end and just like sending it off into the world to say, see ya, have a good trip, it's kind of like putting it on a one-way flight and then never worrying about it again. And if you think about all the things that you do when you take an airplane, you have to research everything in advance, your rates, you have to get your tickets, you have to get your bags packed. You've got to get to the airport like, 3 hours early now and go through all these security checks and get there and wait. But once you're on that plane and it takes off, if you forgot anything, you're totally screwed, right? That's why this whole like traditional model of research, design, build, done, to me is a total failure, and why this, the idea of the agile release train, makes me really happy, right? But so does the fact that we take so many human factors into consideration in this field, like all the lessons we pull from psychology. Something like Fitts' law, which was introduced in 1954 to calculate the performance of assembly line workers, basically states that the bigger the object, the easier it is for us to point at it. Revolutionary. All right? It makes you wonder, like, how long did that study really take? But nevertheless, it's like valuable data that helps us understand the way people work, right? Tesla's law. Every application must have an inherent amount of irreducible complexity. And what the hell does that mean? Well, as a designer, I take it to mean that it's imperative that with every iteration, we try to simplify. Because we're eventually going to hit that point where we can't simplify any further. Now, I own this t-shirt, so to the designer of it, I hope that's like the fact that I paid for it credit enough that I used the image in my slide deck today. Hicks' Law, which is not an Appalachia-based Dick Wolf crime series, which I thought it to be at first. But it dictates that the greater number of choices, the longer it takes to make a decision. These are all very simply understood things, right? This is logic. Simpler solutions bring more satisfaction. The Poka-yoke principle, which is like essentially a Japanese term that can be translated to error proofing, it's otherwise known as creative solutions that help us avoid unintended consequences. And it ensures that like we don't make mistakes. These are also subtle learning scenarios that help users grow, right? Because a friend of mine says that my generation was fearless with technology. This is how we learned to use things. We weren't afraid to just walk up to the VCR and push all the buttons and say, I wonder what this does, right? We didn't care about breaking it, and that's how we learned. We should be able to foster those same types of learning journeys for the people that use the products that we design and build. But really, as I've already stated, I believe it's our relationship with people and putting them first that helps us design products with high levels of recognition and ease of use, right? Because if you're familiar with this book, author Steve Krug laid out some really valuable principles back in 2000, which are still relevant today. And even 14 years later, he revisited and released a revised and expanded version of this book, and nothing had really changed outside of like the visual examples. It was all the same content. Human behavior and the insights from studying it, they have a really long shelf life. They don't change rapidly, right? Sometimes our needs do, but the things that we expect and the way that we do things doesn't. And regarding UX design, he said, your goal should be for each page or screen to be self-evident, so that just by looking at it, the average user can say, I get it. How simple is that? Remember when we started was with the fable, I don't know how I do it, and I don't want to know. I just want to do it. Don't make me think about it. But really, what are some of those principles of human interaction, and like, how can we apply them to our work, right? We're on a mission. We don't have time to parse through information. We only need the information that we need because we're on a journey, right? We're trying to get somewhere. How often do you stop and read all the text on a web page? We have an end goal in mind, right? And we want to get something done and quickly, so let's allow our users to get those things done and get them done quickly. It's important we develop clear visual hierarchies because we use those hierarchies to make it clear to our users that the appearance on a page portrays the relationship between elements. And one thing that drives me absolutely insane is truncation in products or on the web. We should always give users access to the information they need to understand what they're looking for. Not truncate or hide important details and making more work for them. So as designers, we love pretty things. We love orderly things. We love to be able to fit things into boxes, right? The Wall Street Journal app on your left, There's nothing hidden. I can see a full headline on every one of these stories. I know exactly what I'm looking at. On the right, we see some screenshots from Dropbox and Canvas. So those of you that have gone to study at a university lately or teach would be familiar with that. What am I looking at? When I'm trying to find a lecture that I uploaded or a document that I need to get to quickly, I have no idea what any of this stuff means. We shouldn't hide things from people. We should allow them to retrieve their own data, their own documents, and not have to guess at things. This is me a couple semesters ago using Canvas and trying to message one of my students. Now, at the time, I was teaching 2 courses, and the way that this app works is, and this is, a desktop experience. The way this works was first I had to choose which course that student was in before I got a list of all of the students enrolled in that class. Well, I know the names of my classes, but I don't know the numbers. I don't have that memorized. Which class is my typography class? Which class is my print design class? No idea, right? We shouldn't send users on a treasure hunt to figure out how to perform an action. Truncation can also lead to false data or really embarrassing situations, like Ben Gracewood of Venn claiming to be your co-creator of September 11th, right? The main thing you need to know about product instructions, no one's going to ever read them, or you can't expect anyone to read them. Product-based interactions like doors shouldn't need instructions because we don't have time to learn new apps and we don't have time to learn new ways of interacting with them. It's important that we always aim for the self-explanatory, and honestly, if your application needs a really detailed walkthrough to explain, through onboarding on how to use that thing, then you need to start over. You need to go back to the drawing board and make that thing understandable. And it's important that we make those self-explanatory. This is why companies like IKEA and Lego absolutely excel in the product description and instruction area, right? My 6-year-old son can sit down with one of these and basically 98% accuracy put together an entire Lego set without having to read a single word. Just because a UX-minded person wants to understand what goes on behind the scenes doesn't mean that your average user does, right? Mainly because they just don't care. But there's a benefit to this. Once someone learns something, it's unlikely that they're going to switch to something else. When Steve Jobs announced the iPhone, way back when, 2007, there were rumors going around that Apple was going to release a new iPod that could text and make phone calls. And instead of that 2-in-1, we got this amazing, life-changing 3-in-1 device that was not only for music and for communication, but it was also connected to the internet. And it immediately created this entire industry around something that no one ever thought that they needed or had any desire to have, but everyone immediately had to have it, right? A product that we didn't know we needed in our lives, but now it's indispensable. This is like the epitome of human-centered design, because the idea was to create a device that anyone could use for almost any purpose, anywhere, anytime. Think of all the things that the iPhone or the smartphone has supplanted, right? Or is trying to, at least. Wallets, watches, maps. The fact that we were able to create this industry is a reason that a lot of us are here. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, right? Because once we fall in love with that product, we understand it, we have an expectation. Because we generate data at an alarming rate. With something like 95% of the data that exists in the world being generated in the last few years, that doesn't really leave much possibility for something new. Essentially, when we build products, we should design them and build them the way that people expect them to work. And really another way to kind of explain that is, before reinventing the wheel, you have to understand the value, the time, the effort, and the knowledge that went into that thing that you were trying to disrupt. If I was going to design a chat application, right, why wouldn't I look to other chat applications that are out there? Because so many interfaces use similar objectives and use cases, like in this instance, Viber, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger. They employ familiarity to drive usability. People already understand this format and how it works. Why make them learn something completely new? Since 1930, when the very first car radio was introduced, a volume knob that goes down by turning left and up by turning to the right has been employed. Every single radio since 1930, until 2016 when the Honda Pilot upgraded their digital interface and added a slider, something that you have to touch and move, right? Now, they didn't really pay attention or think about the way that people use the volume knob. It's a quick reference thing. It's something I need to hit quickly, right? To aid in conversation, I quickly turn the radio down. If I'm listening to a baseball game and something happens and I hear a lot of chatter, I quickly turn it up. I can reach for it fast and make those quick changes. Now, we've seen things like controls on steering wheels come into play, voice controls, but that knob, with all those 80 years of understanding around it, is always going to be my fastest way to make that change, right? In 2019, the Pilot no longer has a slider. Why reinvent the wheel? Why step outside of those expectations all of a sudden? Technology isn't necessarily always the answer. To make it fancier, to make it more exciting, to make it more interactive, isn't necessarily always the best way to make it more usable. So I'm wrapping up here. We've spent a lot of time talking about like what people don't like and what they're not going to do, but what are some of the things that drive positive interactions? You know, like when we're engrossed in a video game, when we move through a line quickly, when we're able to check out fast, or we don't have to get up from the couch to find out like, what's the name of that guy that was in that thing and that was in that other movie that I was just watching yesterday? All of this makes us like happier because we can perform those actions fast. But how can we add to that with like delight, right? This is the first experience that I ever had with a digital computer interface, right? Whatever you want to call it, right? When I was in junior high and I took a typing class or computer class and we had our Apple IIs and I sat down, and this to me is inviting. It's a way of telling me the power is in your hands. It's your move. What are you going to do, right? Small clues that indicates to our users that things are interactive help us along our discovery, our journey of discovery. Or simple animations that assure us that things are in working order. I think one of the biggest innovations in the video gaming industry, you're probably not going to agree with this one, is the load screen. Because I remember the days of sitting and staring at a black or a blue screen, wondering, is this game going to play? Do I have to take it out and blow on it and try it again, right? Micro interactions that bridge gaps between states and provide us with real-time progress, right? Or feedback and reassurance. Do you really enjoy getting that notification that says for the 4th time in a row that your new password didn't meet the criteria of the password that you need to have, right? Confirming our hopes that there's probably something new waiting for us, which can be both reassuring and at the same time the thing of nightmares. So that's my kind of like whistle-stop tour through user experience thinking. You can find me, same username at all 3 of these. And we've got a short amount of time for questions, if there are any.
Okay, if there's not any questions, John will be...
We got one right over here.
Okay.
So I haven't had any formal UX training, but I'm really interested in getting into it.
Okay.
For someone who's completely new, what are some like resources to learn more? I've already looked at Nielsen Norman Group.
Okay,
So other than
sure.
that.
What's your background?
I'm software engineering.
Okay. One, I kind of like answer that in a couple ways. One, I think like all experience is relative because there's this idea of like collective experiences. I think that we are all a product of our collective experiences, right? And even bad experiences are like good, arsenal for our like database. So that Yes, that's like one place I usually send people to. The 2 books that I have in here, depends on if you're a book person or not. I always recommend those as a starting point. I think they're kind of like the 2 Bibles that we have for this field because they've been around for a long time. And the interesting thing about it is that it's still all relevant today. You know, even though one book was written in the late 1980s, all of those ideas are still relevant. But I say, you know, you have to find your own journey, and I always direct people. I write on Medium. I started writing on Medium recently, but I always direct people to UX collectives, like, you know, groups of people or communities on Medium. And you just need to like kind of sift through a lot of stuff, and there's going to be trash in there, and there's going to be some real gems in there, and you'll start to, the more you read, kind of build your own like understanding around like, yeah, this is good content, this is bad content. You start to like connect threads. So that's it. I mean, you know, I work with a lot of design students, like more like graphic design students, and often at the end of their kind of education journey, most of them say, you know, I'm really interested in user experience design, and I feel like I know nothing about it, unfortunately, and now I'm getting ready to go out into this scary world, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I say, like, come up with a project. You know, you learn by doing and from your peers. So come up with a project, work on it, share it with some people, get some feedback, and that's, you know, how you're going to start to kind of grow and build, like, that understanding.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, Jon will be hanging out with us for the rest of the afternoon, so if you think of something you want to ask him, come on down and ask him. But let's give him a round of applause and thank him for coming today.
Thank you.